What's up, everyone? My guest today is Mosheh Oinounou. He's a former executive producer of CBS Evening News and the guy behind the launch of the 24-hour digital news network, CBSN. We're going to talk to him about the state of journalism, covering the coronavirus pandemic, and much more. I'm Alex Regier, co-founder of Story Hunter, a global marketplace for filmmakers, creative producers, photographers, journalists, and production companies. Over the past 2 years on The Rough Cut, I've traveled the world speaking with some of the most innovative minds in content strategy and video storytelling, exploring the best ways to tell stories for both the big screen and for people increasingly on the go. And then, just like that, everything changed. This is The Rough Cut. Quarantined. We first met at Bloomberg. You were trying to push an initiative to get print reporters to work with TV. Then you went to CBS, started CBSN, and you're sort of been doing a lot of trying to help large companies transition and figure out integrated models to produce for news gathering. And now we're trapped in quarantine.
That's a good recap of the last 10 years, my friend. It's we've been navigating what were already rough waters for a bunch of media companies as all these new platforms developed over time and audience habits changed. And now I think everyone's been thrown for a loop when it comes to the coronavirus and its impact. And in some ways, you could say coronavirus is probably expediting trend lines that we are already seeing in the industry.
Yeah, like what?
I think you could look at it in a number of ways, and you could break it down by types of media, right? So you've seen now a trend line for almost a decade now in the direction of cord cutting. People dropping their big cable packages and going to streaming properties. Well, you've now seen a major increase over the last month in the number of hours, billions of hours streamed by folks. That's how they're getting their content. At the same time, given the way the economy is going, you will probably see cord cutting expedited as people try to save money in different ways and just go to internet-only packages. At the same time, let's look at newspapers, right? A number of local newspapers, hundreds across the country, when you look at the U.S., have been suffering in recent years. McClatchy, one of the biggest chains, is already in bankruptcy. And then you have a number of chains. Gannett, headed by USA Today, has already announced a number of cuts in the lead up to coronavirus, and now since coronavirus, even more cuts. So again, trend lines, whether it's cord cutting, whether it's more, the move to streaming, whether it's difficult times for local newspapers, you're seeing that. And now add on top of that, what you're going to see with the economy is if you're based on an advertising model, you're cutting your forecast now Q2, Q3, Q4, because companies are not going to have the money to advertise. So at the same time, the irony of ironies is people are looking for news and all types of content now more than ever. At the same time, a lot of companies are going to have difficulty monetizing that because there's no advertising. So you could see millions of more streams or clicks, but there's no commercial or pre-roll to go with it.
And how does a TV news leader look at it, this whole coverage differently than a digital news outlet?
Well, what's interesting is it really depends on what your platform and what your limitations are, right? So I spent some time as executive producer of the CBS Evening News, which is a 30-minute broadcast. Take out commercials, you're really left with 21 minutes. So you really have to make, and you're a national broadcast, so you're broadcasting to 360 million Americans. So you got to decide, based on all the information coming at you in regards to coronavirus, what's important. You got to kind of separate the noise from what matters, and ensure that you make those 20 minutes matter for your viewers. At the same time, on the digital side, you have unlimited space, unlimited capacity, and 24 hours a day. So, you're looking at whether it's, let's take CBSN, for example, right? My one of my previous roles running a 24-hour network. Well, there with 24 hours, you need to ensure that you're providing a headline service to folks frequently, giving them the priority items, but that you're utilizing that 24-hour landscape canvas, if you will, to really talk about stories that matter to everybody, and that you're not just focused on covering the noise out of Washington, but ultimately what's happening way outside of Washington. And I think that there's been some real impressive journalism done over the course of the last couple of months. That let's take, for example, a lot of the medical personnel, where you were hearing one thing from Washington or leaders saying we got everything handled, everyone has what they need, testing, PPE, etc. When you had local reporters across the country talking to the nurses and the medical personnel and showing folks pictures of what was actually happening behind the scenes. And ultimately, a lot of that reporting had an impact at the local, state, and federal level.
Yeah, and it's funny. You're like one of the most fast-paced newsmen I've ever met from back when our time at Bloomberg. And it's so funny now you're not no longer at CBS or Bloomberg or any of these companies. And I've been watching your Instagram, and it's like I don't read any other news. I'm just watching these recaps of Instagram. Is that because you're so high intensity and you need something to do? What's going on over there?
What's interesting is I now have a new life away from kind of the 24/7 news world. At the same time, for those of us who work in news or work in journalism, it's in your blood. And so I think that ultimately how that all came about is probably 5 or 6 weeks ago, and I'm sure you got these too. I was getting random text messages from people with chain texts saying, beware, I have a friend in the military who says the whole country is getting shut down tomorrow. Yeah, like I have a friend whose uncle is high up in the military, and I was so frustrated by it because A, it wasn't true. B, it was leading to chaos, right? Empty store shelves. This is how riots happen when, information is spread quickly, no basis in fact. I mean, you can look at examples. Go to the situation in Myanmar with Rohingya Muslims and how Facebook and WhatsApp was used. You could go back 25 years to Rwanda and the Hutus and the Tutsis and how they used radio to manipulate folks. Well, this was, literal fake news, right? Fake headlines coming via text. So I took to my Instagram to just try to inform folks. I have still contacts with folks at FEMA and Department of Homeland Security and NYPD, et cetera. And I was like, guys, this is not true. And you're doing everyone a disservice and at worst, risking lives if you continue to push out this sort of information. So frankly, from doing that, people thanked me for that information. I put up a couple more articles and realized that at a time where there's so many things happening and so many headlines out there, that, at least for my friends and family and now more followers on Instagram, I'm trying to curate headlines that I've vetted and headlines that I think are relevant to people's lives and try to give people kind of a synthesis of what matters out there and amongst the thousands of things going on.
And how do you see this crisis, in terms of fake news and all and headlines and stuff? Is this similar to almost any crisis, or what are the kind of differences here?
There's a Wired magazine article that referred to 9/11 as the last analog crisis. 9/11 was pre-Twitter, pre-smartphone, pre-Facebook, pre-all that, pre-YouTube. And so this crisis is really the first kind of global situation that's happening in the smartphone era and the social media era where and anyone is a broadcaster, right? And we've seen through election cycles, et cetera, hundreds of thousands of fake news organizations, fake news accounts, et cetera, created that have been manipulated elections here and abroad. And so, I think now more than ever with all the noise out there and people not knowing what to believe and worried about their own safety and the safety of their family, I think that's the challenge everyone has right now, at least when it comes to working at major news organizations or even independent folks who care about getting real information out there. To try to ensure there are places people can go and sources people can turn to where they can trust the information.
It's harder to get the on-the-ground reporting as well because of the restrictions and the dangers of going out and reporting. But at the same time, more people are on their phones, watching and consuming or going live. So that seems like a crazy dynamic we've never seen before.
I mean, you know this, Alex. You're a reporter. You've reported around the globe. You know the importance of seeing something with your own eyes before you report it. Now, obviously, there's things like Zoom, FaceTime, etc., and you try to vet things as much as you can. But at the end of the day, nothing ranks up there with like actually being there with the sources, with the people, seeing what's going on. And obviously there are reporters and cameramen, etc., who are getting in there to show you those images and risking their own lives and taking precautions that they can. But that's where I think it's important for journalists to do what they can to vet out stuff and not just see something on social media and retweet it. At the same time, it's also important for consumers of media to the extent that they can, given that they have busy lives and they're dealing with their own situations, to not just believe everything, but also do their own vetting and see if things that they're being sent are being reported anywhere else.
And what do you think, there's a lot of journalists, production companies, filmmakers watching this. What tips would you give, like as someone who's moved up the ranks to running one of the major news organizations? What are and you're a pretty young guy. What type of tips would you give them?
There's a number of things I would suggest. Number one, if you're in this industry, you're in it because you're curious about the world. You're curious about things. You're questioning things. So it's important for you to just voraciously consume media and content. To try to know a little bit about everything. I often tell journalism students, or students who aspire for a career in journalism, do not study journalism. Journalism in many ways is a practical profession, and you'll learn that at major organizations. Become an expert in something, economics, psychology, etc. Now more than ever, we need medical journalists who have an expertise and can read journal studies about, and from epidemiologists. There have been people who've said that the White House press corps should be replaced by a bunch of medical reporters right now to get at what really matters. Same thing goes given the economic situation. Become an expert in economics, etc. So that's just kind of what you need to know. As far as skill sets, it's all about learning the next platform, right? That, if we were talking, in the last 10 years, from Facebook to Snapchat to Instagram, the real growth of YouTube over the last cycle, and even the random things that have popped up like Periscope, etc. Learn every new platform. You don't know what's going to blow up, and ultimately all we do as storytellers is tell a story and ultimately try to customize it for a platform. One thing I've been working on at Condé Nast Entertainment is working on some things for Quibi, the new streaming platform that optimizes verticality. And so one of the things they're really focused on is how do they shoot, edit, and produce content optimized for vertical phone as opposed to 16:9 on horizontal.
What I know you're kind of you've always had a very international perspective. What are the kind of interesting things that you've seen in how the coronavirus is affecting different countries or different regions?
Well, it's very interesting because you've seen so many different approaches from various countries, right? You've seen, it began in China, and it's unclear right now what exactly took place in China. Can we believe the numbers we saw there, etc. And that they're opening up places like Wuhan, but then closing down other parts of the country. And so China is kind of, I think, ripe for many investigations by many reporters out there as to what happened, who knew what when, etc. You've seen approaches by countries like Taiwan and Singapore, which jumped on testing. South Korea, another one out there in Asia, jumped on testing, were able to manage this so they didn't have to completely shut down their economies. And they're gradually opening up, but also realizing that until you have real medication for this or vaccine, that fully opening up your country is going to be challenging. You've seen countries in Europe, Austria is notable. Austria is going to start opening up soon because of the way they manage this with testing. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Sweden, who other Scandinavian countries have been on top of this, but Sweden decided to implement a more laissez-faire policy, and they're seeing some of the most skyrocketing rates. And then obviously, really well covered the crises in Italy and Spain, unfortunately, where you've seen huge death tolls, and they don't know when they're going to see the end of it there. So, and that's just covering that half of the globe. But there's been, it'll be very interesting to see what develops out of this. Out of World War II, you saw the creation of the United Nations and a bunch of international organizations that were built around countries cooperating in preventing a global war, right? So out of this, clearly the World Health Organization has not done what's necessary here. So what major organizations are going to be created, tweaked, etc., to ensure that this sort of thing doesn't happen the way it has?
Let's take it back a little bit. And, I think there's a lot of people who are starting digital operations, watching this within large companies. You did that at CBS, launching CBSN. Maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of the challenges and how you overcame some of the challenges of pitching, winning budget, and implementing your idea for when you're within a legacy company like CBS.
Yeah, so ultimately, when you're trying to build something new within a legacy company, you benefit from the fact that ideally there's some funding, there's some know-how, there's some capacity, but at the same time, the challenge is breaking ground and trying to do something innovative at a place that's been doing this same thing for a very long time. And so at a very basic level, you got to figure out what your mission is, right? And so the mission at CBSN was, how do we do something here that we've never done before? A 24-hour linear channel, streaming channel that is on multiple platforms, but also provides the audience video on demand. So you're providing people a lean back experience where they can just watch, and an experience where they can isolate clips. At the same time, you're doing it at a place where they've done a handful of shows, incredible shows, over time, 60 Minutes and Sunday Morning and CBS Evening News, and getting an organization to operate on a 24/7 level as opposed to on a per broadcast level. So ultimately, you're dealing with a new kind of technical challenge. You're dealing with an editorial challenge. How do we amortize that content? How do we ensure we have structures that were built for a different era, tweaked for the new era, but also not hurting the existing products? And how do we, on a very fundamental level, we don't know who the audience is for this new product. We think we know who they are, younger folks who are cord cutters, who aren't watching the news at 6:30 every night. But at the end of the day, you've got to build a system and build processes that inevitably are going to change and then change again and then change again. Because you're going to turn it on one day, you're going to get it going and make it work, which by the way is mission one. Don't try to run before you walk, and don't try to walk before you crawl. Let's start, very small and work our way up, especially when you're doing something brand new. One thing you do want to rely on and prioritize when you're building something with an existing organization is winning over support within that organization. That ultimately your success is predicated on the existing personnel and other parts of the organization buying into that success. Because the first thing in a new organization is, they're the new kids. If they're successful, they're going to take away from our resources or our success or our whatever. So how do you ensure that you bring in key personnel from there and that they're bought in, that, a rising tide lifts all ships, right? Ultimately, by them helping you, you'll ultimately be able to help them. And so over time, what you saw is that by having the 24/7 product and channel at CBS, the other programs benefited from the fact that there was 24/7 infrastructure, a group of people who were committed to covering things immediately that ultimately would then help the show at night and the show the following morning by just having content quicker, more available. And so, that in short are kind of a couple of the things we were focused on.
And so maybe you can share some strategies to get that buy-in from the stakeholders, whether they're the execs or they're the producers who have been doing it in one way for decades?
Listen, you have to be realistic, right? That ultimately you aren't going to convert everybody, but you're going to convert some of them. And, I think you need to approach things with a matter of both urgency, but also you need to understand that, especially those folks out there who are much more digitally oriented, coming into organizations who've been doing something else. And that's the major magazine chains, that's the newspapers, that's the legacy TV companies, that you have to spend some time learning about the existing organization, the people who are there, what matters to them, and kind of building your Venn diagram. That this is what matters to them, this is what matters to you, but there's actually a whole lot in the middle there. And so frankly, we talked about your success. You asked earlier, how do you become successful in this business? It's relationships, right? It's building relationships with people. And so, ultimately you're given a mission to kind of help an organization see the light and move towards where the world is going. But you got to take the people with you, because they can stand in your way and they can ensure failure if they're not bought in. So frankly, it's identifying your potential allies in the organization and really approaching it with kind of a political lens of like who matters within the organization, who's influential, and who also has an understanding for what needs to happen that can be an apostle for you.
Is there any advice that you would give to people that are trying to convince their organization to start something new? Like, what is the best way to approach it?
Listen, at the end of the day, it's about the bottom line. The bottom line is the bottom line. So, no matter what media organization you're in right now, everyone is trying to diversify their revenue stream. So ultimately, a lot of journalists, etc., love awards and doing stuff for the big J journalism, okay? And that's important, and you need to work on that for the sake of, helping society, the brand of the organization, etc. But if you're looking at pitching something new, and particularly kind of a larger thing, right? A new product or some sort of show or vertical on a new platform, look at the economics of it. That ultimately, whether you're a newspaper looking at the subscription model, whether you're a cable network looking at the subscription model, that you're looking at taking that pie chart and opening up a new slice. And, for the past couple of years, it's been podcasting, right? That, by the way, there was no money there until there was some money there. And now it's exploded. So if you're making the pitch within your organization for something new, is there a potential revenue stream advertiser? Or more significantly, subscriber, that you can pitch around either a niche audience or, kind of broadcast audience. And by broadcast, I mean everybody, right? And what's possible there. And I think that's where you start. And if you get in the financial stakeholders and the C-suite there, that's one box you got to check. And then ultimately, if something gets approved, then it's winning over the masses and the people within the organization you're going to need, and potentially who are going to be working harder than they already are working to now feed the new product to see the merits of what you're doing.
So do you have any kind of last thoughts that you'd want to share for the story hunters out there and the storytellers and people who are out there reporting the news right now during this time?
There's never been more outlets for content in the history of time. And so if you're a storyteller, whether it's short form, whether you optimize for TikTok, whether you optimize for a 5-part series that you want to pitch to Netflix, we have a global crisis that we don't know how it's going to end, and ultimately there will be so many stories that come out of this that we're not even aware of right now. And ultimately, I think that there'll be a great appetite for things, and there's going to be a lot of change there that can happen based on those stories. So, and by the way, those are the people who are kind of covering the hard news thing. At the same time, you're a scripted creator. Well, you've seen examples like John Krasinski, the actor, started a weekly YouTube show about good news. You've seen a lot of folks innovating on Zoom and TikTok right now in terms of compelling storytelling, visual storytelling, etc. So, right now, if you have the opportunity and the time to experiment, there's going to be a lot of really cool, interesting things that will have an audience and have buyers out there. Try some things. It's going to be really fascinating to see kind of what comes out of this.
I never thought I'd be watching your IG stories for my news, but there you go.
I never thought I would be posting stories on Instagram about a global pandemic and interpreting charts, but it's one of those things where I kind of look at it as, at least IG stories, or what I'm trying to do in IG stories, is kind of like a Drudge report for coronavirus for IG stories. And Matt Drudge, say what you will about him, was very innovative in what he came up with almost 30 years ago now, and it still works, right? Like identifying links, curating news for people, curating headlines that matter and are interesting, still has an audience out there, regardless of what platform you're doing it on. So try some stuff. It'll be really interesting to see what sticks, and ultimately independent operators out there like you and me who are much more agile will have opportunities to innovate, and then allow the major media companies to kind of follow along when they see what works. They'll buy your product or they'll mimic your product, depending on which one you're talking about.
Let's do it. All right, thanks a lot. Thanks for taking the time. We'll see you.
Appreciate it, man. Stay safe, stay healthy.
All right. Peace.